this sort of gets us, to one aspect that I appreciated in your book, which is talking a little bit about the economics of like the drugs, the drug market, and like one that I think, you covered really well was nicotine and tobacco, wherein most people sort of view what happened, for example, with the cigarette companies with like disdain. Right, they lied to us; it causes cancer, etc. But you make this point and sort of highlighted in the book. This, like, yes, that's true, right? But this is also how business functions, right? And there's this substitution that happens where it's like there's something as if there's something uniquely evil about the tobacco industry, when in fact this is just sort of capitalist businesses operating, as they typically do.
Yeah, in both the cases of the licit drug market and the illicit drug market, I want to say that drug producers and distributors are kind of operating according to basic, laws that you can learn in business school. There is insidious stuff that happens in the legal realm. Part of that is the fact that they're selling psychoactive drugs, which are both very, very powerful and very addictive, and so something in the nature of the substance itself has to do with the absurd profit margins they can get. But really, if you look at the sort of their typical practices, it's what any business does. It's just the fact that they sell drugs that is the problem. In the illegal realm, it's very similar. You get a lot of media portrayals of the illegal drug trade are predictably gruesome. There's a lot of popular television shows on the illegal drug trade, and you sort of get a romanticized picture of it there. But really, a lot of these guys are just doing the same things that their legal counterparts are doing. Like Pablo Escobar, the guy who's sort of like most associated with violence in the drug trade, like his big innovation was creating this insurance scheme that protected cocaine shipments, like going out of Colombia. Like it's like not very glamorous stuff. And the violence that does exist in the drug trade, it's really, it kind of like obeys market principles, right? Like when you engage in exercises of like really intimidating violence, part of that is like just like human capital development, right? You're like building your brand within a specific like niche market. So in all these ways, I want to say the drug trade, it's not that different from, how capitalism operates more generally, but we do like to think of it as some special case. And in fact, it's like I would say it's like a helpful projection, helpful way in which we can project our anxieties about the functioning of normal society onto this thing that we think of as wholly other from what we're involved in.
Yeah, you make the point on that about crack too, and like as the post-civil rights failures of neoliberalism become clear as like, communities that don't have opportunities, don't like have been completely underinvested in. Like it's not a surprise that something like this would take hold so deeply there, and like we don't, instead of like addressing that, it's sort of like, ooh, what's in this special compound, or what's in the people themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there have been reporters that that went into sort of like crack neighborhoods in the 80s and 90s, and we're like, look, like it's not the drug that people are saying it is, right? This whole body orgasm thing, it's pretty good, but like let's not exaggerate. And they were also like, if you've only got bad things on the horizon, like crack can make a kind of like sixth sense to you, right? That it does offer a kind of like comfort in degraded conditions. But more generally, what I want to say is that crack really filled the void, the economic void in a lot of these neighborhoods. So it wasn't just that certain urban areas became centers of crack use. They really became centers of crack economies. And there was filling in where there should have been a jobs program, essentially, right? Like where that stuff is lacking, it sort of made sense to be involved in the drug trade. There was this famous advertisement from McDonald's I think it was in the 90s, like featuring this young boy named Calvin, like he's walking through his neighborhood, like he's sort of like avoiding his friends, and the whole time there are these voiceovers like, oh, Calvin's really cleaned himself up, right? Like he's on a good path now. And at the end of the commercial, they show him like put on a McDonald's hat and like sort of smile and say, hey, welcome to McDonald's. McDonald's at the time was paying $3 an hour. right? Like, it's no surprise that that was not the kind of glowing option that McDonald's portrayed it as, and that a lot of young people got involved in the drug trade. It's filling in where legitimate economic activity should be.
In a minute, actually, let's do the drug war first, then we can talk about pharmaceuticals like today. But I mean, could you talk about the kind of launch of the drug war, both in the way that it was sort of maybe presented to the public, and also sort of like the actual just sort of base political reasons for why, again, like certain drugs were targeted over others, and what the kind of political goal of Nixon and the people who followed him were in sort of criminalizing certain kinds of drug use?
Yeah, there's a famous quote from, I think it's John Ehrlichman, one of Nixon's deputies, where he basically says, look, we wanted to, our political enemies were the New Left and black people. And so what did we want to do? We wanted to marginalize them. You can't make it illegal to be a leftist or to be black. And so what can you do instead? You can target different kinds of behaviors that you associate with those groups and then demonize them that way. It's a remarkably bold statement in one sense, but I think it's kind of telling us what we already know, which is that when people vilify drugs, they're not really vilifying the drugs themselves. They're vilifying the things that they associate with those drugs and the people they associate with those drugs. And at the onset of the war on drugs, there were a lot of different concerns, actually, right? It wasn't just targeting one group of people. This was when Vietnam vets were coming back to the States, a lot of whom were using opium and heroin. And there were legitimate fears that, all these servicemen were going to return and bring a whole drug scourge with them. And so there was that. There was, a lot of articles about the pharmaceutical industry at the time and the egregious profits they were making, but also their sort of like lax regulatory structures. There was real fear around amphetamines and benzodiazepine use, right? So long as housewives could take it in the early 50s and stay peppy and thin, it was fine. But by the 60s, there were real fears that people were misusing these drugs. So there were a lot of different things that the initial phases of the war on drugs wanted to control. But what I emphasize in the book is that it was just that. It was other things that they wanted to control. There are a variety of social ills that people wanted to get a handle on, and drug policy was a convenient sort of means of doing so.
I mean, it's like similar to policing in general too, right? Like you have a big social problem of like poverty
it's
in
wild
this country,
how.
and the cops. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, David. I thought you're done.
No, I mean, jump in, Matt. You're ready.
Oh, I was just going to say, it's wild how frequently there are these sort of secondary, it's really about that. Like, I didn't realize Prohibition was coming after German breweries. Talk about that a little bit, and like sort of like politics and the inability for that to become a sort of like class political moment. It became more of a look at the scary Germans with their big breweries.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't just that, but it was the Germans and their big scary breweries as well. The German brewers were very efficient industrialists. They took advantage of rail to increase their distribution. They vertically integrated their operations with saloons. So the kind of like brew pub that's common today, where you actually get stuff brewed in the place where you drink it. That was also kind of an invention of the time. And a lot of the big names are still with us, like Miller, Schlitz, Busch, like all these big breweries started in the late 19th century. And so, at the onset of the war, it was pretty hard for them to maintain their lobbying power, right? It was pretty easy for temperance forces to vilify them. But there were a lot of other things that like happened at the time as well. I mean, the American Medical Association decided in the 1910s that alcohol no longer had legitimate medical use. This is something that's often forgotten. The doctors in the late 19th century, they often turned to alcohol. It's a regular feature in the history of drugs. they make you feel better. And so the overlap there with medical uses is kind of unsurprising. But in the 1910s, the AMA decided that it was no longer an acceptable medical substance. The 16th Amendment allowed the state to collect taxes in a way that it had been previously like dependent upon taxes on alcohol. So a lot of things sort of like happened at that particular moment that allowed prohibition to sort of go through. And there are a lot of contingent factors there. But still, I want to say, like why did temperance and prohibition have the kind of moral force in the United States and fairly uniquely? Well, it's difficult to like look at that, in the face of the fact that Americans have traditionally loved alcohol. It's hard to look at that and not see something about the social conditions in the United States at the time.
Yeah, I mean, talking about that, I mean, one thing that I think is sort of interesting, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, is like we have seen this pretty dramatic shift in like the way that marijuana is portrayed, thought about, and obviously with like legalization for both medical and recreational use. I mean, how do you sort of square that in the sense of like, both on like the political side and the business side, right? Like there's less need right now to go after hippies, right, for smoking marijuana. Is that the major shift, or is the demographics that have been smoking changing? I'm curious to hear, your sort of thoughts on why that has opened up so much in recent years.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the imperatives of the war on drugs since the 70s are sort of no longer in place, insofar as the coordinates of neoliberalism are sort of breaking down, right? Mm-hmm. Sort of traditional ideological justifications. They're no longer there. And so there's less of a need to sort of like police people's behaviors and people in the same kind of way. That being said, it's this very odd moment where there are these legalization movements and things are being normalized in a certain sense, but we still have just an abominable number of people in prison for non-violent drug offenses. And so it shouldn't be overstated, right? That like the contradiction is palpable and that it works for certain political interests, right? That they don't have any interest in resolving it. And so there's a lot of talk about marijuana legalization, and the Democrats, it seems like an obvious issue that they should just capitalize on. And it's one of those things that could be done through executive order. In other words, it doesn't need to go through Congress. Like at any point, Joe Biden could sit down and sign one document and marijuana would be legal federally. It's that simple. But they don't do it because the contradiction works for them, right? Like they're happy to sort of signal in the right direction. But if they actually legalize marijuana, if they actually followed through on the consequences of that and let people out of prison for nonviolent drug offenses who are there, the political backlash from the Republicans is just not worth it in their calculations. And so, they're happy with that contradiction, that to let it be legal in most states, but illegal federally, and a massive mess in terms of mass incarceration.
And I was just saying, cynically, politically too, it's like a really great carrot to have in states that are controlled by Republicans, right? It's like it's a good reason to maybe get interest here in Texas to back, the Democratic Party, because maybe they can get, citywide level decriminalization or something like that. It's also interesting. I heard this from a friend who works on the ledge, and so I, take it with a grain of salt. But one of the reasons that they were citing as to why marijuana, like decriminalization or legalization in Texas, is probably far ways away here, is because it makes so much money in West Texas, where a lot of people drive through, for very underfunded county and sheriffs, because like they can find people, get some money for it. They don't get much money from the state. It's a big money maker for them. And just the way that the political map is here, they're a very powerful lobby. Despite how popular it might be with like the general population, even the people living in that part of the state, right? There still are a lot of like perverse incentives for prohibition.
Yeah. Can you talk about the international, sorry, you can respond to that, but also the international role? Cause I've wondered, like, are we doing this because there's allies that are really into fighting the drug war still? And, you know, we've also exported that to some extent, to just not to overegg the question too much. But.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly on the previous point. I mean, another thing I wanted to say was that, you know, we're at a moment where there is a dearth of private investment in a lot of sort of like needed things. And a lot of the sources of profitability are sort of privatizing public assets, public businesses. And you can sort of see what's happening with drugs as an extension of that, right? You're bringing something that had previously been out of the realm of profit making into it to allow people to like have some source of profitability. In the same way that you can sort of see that happening with the privatization of state function. And so there's a certain sick economic sense to what's going on as well. It's just sort of, you know, like very, very basic economic processes at work. On the international scene, so you know, the United States really did lead the effort in global drug prohibition. As you can imagine, drugs were enormously profitable to a wide range of interests in the world in the late 19th century. Growing it, trading it, advertising it. There was a lot of money to be made. The United States had a huge patent medicine industry, and in patent medicines there were, you know, opium, cocaine, alcohol, like all the good stuff. And so it was just an enormously profitable trade. And so you might say, like, well, how did someone come along and say this stuff needs to be banned? Mm-hmm. And I think that at first it really was an extension of the kind of moral paternalism of the temperance movement, that there were, you know, predominantly, you know, Protestant men who wanted to bring civilization to the world, and they thought that they could. And it does seem very odd at the time, but like Charles Brent, who was a main driver of Prohibition, he was the U.S. representative to the early international drug control conferences. He was a priest, and so saw his role in predominantly moral terms. Right? He has this famous line that I used as a subtitle for the 4th chapter. He said that his whole purpose was to bring civilization to the Orient. That was his goal. And so I think that early drug prohibition really emerges out of that impulse. By the end of the Second World War, however, in the second phase outlined in the book, there were different things at stake. And I think that the war really proved to the United States that control over international drug flows was very important. And in its quest to become the global hegemon, controlling those flows was of central importance. And so Harry Anslinger, who returns again and again in the book, he was the chief of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics from 1930 to 1962. He made it his priority to make sure that any drug flows around the world, both illegal and legal, were controlled by the Americans. So it was very much a sort of state building exercise. Like why does the United States have this uniquely profitable pharmaceutical industry? Well, it's because we took control of all the drug trades around the world in the post-war period. There's a great book by historian Susanna Rice, and it's about this period. It's about Anslinger and the control of international drug flows after the Second World War, and it's just called "We Sell Drugs." It's a very good title.
That's great. There's a couple more things I was hoping to get to if we're okay on time. One, I mean, just while we're sort of like on the drug war and like the carceral state, first thing I wanted to sort of ask you was if you could sort of help people wrap their heads around like drug addiction, right? Because, you know, that is an issue that, like, you know, I've known many people who I love dearly, you know, really suffer through and even pass away from. You know, could you sort of frame, you know, like the social issue of addiction, like historically and within capitalism? Because as we said at the opening, like a lot of these drugs have been used throughout history. I mean, you know, what like kind of social policies and lack of social policies might lead to addiction? How should we sort of think about drugs maybe in a society where we had a little bit more leeway in designing social policy in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, the last part of that question gets into more complicated territory than just addiction, because one unfortunate facet of drug discourse is that the addiction and drug registers tend to get confused, right? And so drug discourse tends to be about addiction discourse. When I think most people know, if you ask, I think most people about their drug experiences, you're going to get predominantly positive stories, right? On the whole. That's not to say that like drugs aren't a real problem for a lot of people. It's just to say that we shouldn't confuse those two registers. And when it comes to creating drug policy, it shouldn't just be addiction policy. On the question about addiction, so I think that one thing that has been very clear in the history of trying to treat addiction is that you can't intimidate addicts out of their addiction. It just doesn't work. And so the project of Prohibition has been just enormously regressive in that sense and many other senses. But on that particular point, even Richard Nixon, Nixon was the first person to legalize opiate consumption in America in the form of methadone clinics. And even he saw that it was going to be impossible to use the typical rhetoric and just sort of beef up on policing to get addicts to just stop using. It just doesn't work that way. What has worked is a combination of sort of more controversial things. A lot of it is just sort of meeting basic material needs, right? Housing, healthcare, et cetera. But part of what's really helped traditionally is different maintenance medications. So there's been a curious attachment to methadone in particular as a maintenance medication for opiate addicts in particular. And I think that part of that is because methadone doesn't get you high in the exact kind of ways that heroin or morphine does. And so, even drug Puritans can sort of see some use in it. At least they're not getting high is the logic. But there are a lot of places where, morphine, heroin are distributed as maintenance medications. In Canada, for instance, there are these opiate vending machines. They're not vending machines. They are vending machines, but you have to get a certain ID and you have to be registered, and they monitor your use and whatnot. But it's basically allows people to go, dial up the amount of morphine that they want, get it in, medically pure form, like they're able to take it like with the safe route of administration, and all of the perverse things that happen as a result of drug prohibition, right? Like dirty needles, et cetera, all that stuff goes away. But what they've also found is that people tend to level off over time. Like not everyone's going to quit right away, but at first people get access to opiates and they go, they have more than usual, let's say. But then they even off, right? The whole point is not that they're going to naturally overdose when given access to these drugs. Is that they're going to find some point where they can take it, they can go to work, right? They don't have to worry about like getting it after work. They don't have to worry about the different things they might have to do to acquire the drug. And so as a result, they can just sort of resume their normal lives. And opiates in particular are drugs that you can take over long periods of time without severe medical issues following it from it. William Burroughs miraculously lived to his 80s or something, and he took heroin his entire life. Other drugs, not so much. Methamphetamine is not something that should be used long term. It does have disastrous consequences. But with opiates, it's a kind of thing where maintenance medications do work. And in the conclusion of the book, to get to sort of the more policy question, I do touch on a few of the things that liberal drug reformers really hammer on. Affordable drug treatment services, affordable and good drug treatment services. There are a lot of sketchy services out there. Different police reforms, legalizing marijuana. There's a lot of very obvious stuff that the left could pursue, provided that these reforms maintain some degree of majoritarian support. But at the end of the day, a lot of the things that we consider to be specifically drug problems have to do with problems in the broader society. And, to go back to what we said before with that Ehrlichman quote, it's pretty clear that when people are trying to control drugs, they're trying to control other things about the society. And so when we tackle the problem of drugs, we always have to keep that in mind, that it's the broader problems of society that are being attacked. And so when we come up with solutions for them, we have to think about it in that capacious sense. And so I sort of close the book by saying there's really two things that could address a lot of different facets about what people are concerned about with psychoactive drugs. And that's jobs and healthcare. You provide people with good jobs, you provide people with decent, affordable healthcare. A lot of the things that we associate with pernicious drug use are going to go away.
So one of the things I wanted to touch on with you on before we close is how maybe people who are anti-capitalist or socialist should think about drugs that are used right now in a clinical setting to treat mental health issues, right? Anxiety, depression, etc. Because there's a lot of different strains of thoughts on the left. It can get very controversial, the way that we talk about them. And I'm just curious, like somebody who I know like is very interested in these subjects in general, and also wrote a book on the history of drugs in the US. I mean, could you talk a little bit about how maybe we should orient ourselves and think about these things? Because obviously it's like, important treatment for a lot of people. It's also a very large industry, and the water gets very muddied on this conversation. So I'd be curious if you could give us a bit of clarity, if possible.
Yeah, I mean, I would say a lot depends on which mental illness we're talking about and which drugs we're talking about. I think so. I'm sort of working my way into your question, but I think that part of what's controversial about the whole field is that some people would want to say that contemporary forms of mental illness are reflections of capitalist society in some sense. And so, you're treating something that is historically specific and not necessarily biologically rooted. And other people want to say that, like, no, this is something that is not about capitalism. This is something that we should think of as not in terms of capitalism or anti-capitalism. There's like there's a gray area there that a lot of people get very heated about. And again, I think we need to get more specific about the kind of conversation we're having. But I mean, let me just take one example, because we're going through an amphetamine shortage today with ADHD. I've seen and heard a lot of callousness towards people who are suffering through the moment, and just, there's no need for that ever, of course. But the replies are oftentimes like, kind of reductive and supportive of pharmaceutical ad company, ad copy when it comes to like the definitions of the disease. And I would just say, like, we have to look at these things historically. That's part of why I wrote the book. The category of ADHD has not always existed in its current form. Amphetamine use has not always existed in its current form. There's a long history to these things, and we can see these categories as absolutely real and absolutely things that people suffer from, while also injecting some historical consciousness as to like how these things came to be and how we came to treat them in this particular way. So I understand that that's not very helpful in terms of the sort of like broader question, but it's a difficult one, I mean, I would say in general, people's experience should not be dismissed. There's no reason for that. At the same time, it can't be the only thing guiding policy and positions, that there are broader historical factors at work in both drug use and mental illness, and shutting out that conversation doesn't help either.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, I think, to disentangle, these things. But for example, when you see like the Department of Education tweeting out, suicide hotlines when this Supreme Court decision came out too, it's like recognizing that, being able to recognize that it's like there's there's a lot of bad actors out there too, right? Both like there are pharmaceutical industries that sort of want certain results. There's also people who I think are just very quick and willing to sort of dismiss, people's individual experiences and cases because they want to sort of uphold a grand theory of everything as well.
Right. No grand theories. That should be the conclusion. We don't need grand theories anymore. We've done it. We don't need it anymore.
Yeah. Well, Benjamin, I really appreciate you coming on and talking to us about this book. It's a really great read, folks. It's drugs. It's fun. It's fun to read about. Quick fixes. It's up from Verso. We'll put a link below for people to find it. Thank you so much again.
Yep. Thanks for having me.